Hi everybody, welcome to today's webinar on helping teams to reach their full potential. I'm Jackie Barber and I'll shortly be handing over to Sarah Rasmussen, who's the Managing Consultant here at PCL. Sarah is an expert in the HOGAN assessments and she has over 12 years experience, including working on multiple projects with teams in the UK and globally. But before handing over, I just wanted to go through a few housekeeping points. So we've muted all of the lines to minimise any background noise, but we would love for you to submit questions. So please do so using the functionality on the side of the screen, and we'll get through as many of those as we can at the end. We're also going to be recording this webinar today, so we'll circulate a copy of that recording together with the slides after the webinar. So I'm now going to hand over to Sarah.
Thank you, Jackie. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me. And what I wanted to do really is, first of all, I wanted to go through and explore why measuring personality and values is so critical to the success of teams. Then I wanted to introduce the HOGAN model, which is a way of assessing teams that can form the basis for team workshops. I'll then go on to talk you through a case study where I've had an opportunity to use the model with a team and just kind of draw on a bit of my experience. And then finally at the end, just a little bit of time to talk about the practicalities of how one would go about accessing the team report. And as Jackie mentioned, an opportunity for questions thereafter. So before we kind of dive in and look more at the detail, I thought it was quite important just to make the point, what is a team? And just really to make that critical difference between a group of individuals that may have been thrust together and what a team really is. So clearly having 3 or more people, but I think what's really the important point is the fact that they need to be dependent on each other in some way and be working towards a common goal. And in some way that their success and failure is intertwined. So in effect, these are the sorts of characteristics that we would be looking for in order to define what we really truly mean by having a team. And why do we think that focusing on teams is so important? Well, increasingly research would suggest that organizations are using teams more and more. So at least 48% of organizations use teams to accomplish objectives. And indeed, 54% of individuals spend at least 30% of their day in team settings. And the point being that good team working well together can be very effective and can increase effectiveness within organizations. I came across an interesting piece of research from John Chambers, who's the chairman at Cisco, who said that by adjusting the structure of their organization within the electronics company, they were able to reduce the time that some of the product transitions took from as many as 7 years down to 1 year, and that was by creating effective working teams. So just a general point there really, that by having good working teams, it can increase the effectiveness of an organization, i.e. making the whole can be greater than the sum of its parts. So I think that's just something to bear in mind. And so we've established that teams are important to the success of organizations, and the other point really to make is, well, why do we think that personality and values are so critical here as well? Historically, teams have often been formed by thrusting together a bunch of people who are determined by what their functional roles might be. So for instance, what position they have, what their technical skills are. However, there is quite a lot of evidence to suggest that the psychological role people play, i.e. the kind of person they are, is actually quite critical for the success of a team. If you think, for instance, even some of the most expensive professional sports teams can often fail to perform, even though they're made up of hugely talented individuals, if as a team they don't have some kind of psychological synergy. So a more effective approach focuses much more on thinking about the importance of people's personality in that mix, rather than solely just on matching people for their skills. And so it's thinking about what role the person plays in the team, how the team individuals are likely to interact together, but also considering whether their values are aligned as well. I just wanted really to introduce a couple of examples of some studies that I've come across which kind of illustrates this point. There are a vast array of these studies found in research, but just to pull out a couple of studies really. This first one, where there were 133 factory teams, they found that where they had higher levels of interpersonal sensitivity, curiosity, and emotional stability, that tended to result in more cohesive teams. And they also find that they had more effective teams where people had higher levels of altruism, which in HOGAN terms would be considered one of the kind of key values areas which can bind people together. Along a similar line, a large meta-analysis study where they reviewed lots and lots of different pieces of research generally found that people's personality really did, the combination of team members' personality, I should say, really does influence how much cooperation there is in a team, how much information sharing there is, and ultimately overall team performance. So the point really being is why who we are has an impact on our behavior, and therefore has an impact on how we interact with others, and that ultimately can have a big impact on how effective a team would be. And then lastly, just to touch on this study where they looked at astronauts. This one was particularly interesting given the nature of their roles. In order to get the right mix of crew to be going into space, they conduct simulations. So for instance, a simulation of a journey into space, where they would be putting a whole load of astronauts in cramped quarters for quite a long time, say hundreds of days. And when they've done those sorts of simulations, they found that small sub-teams tend to form amongst the crew members based very much around similar values, but also higher levels of agreeability and higher emotional stability in terms of personality aspects tended to link to team cohesiveness and cooperation. So the overall message really being there that there is a strong link between personality and team effectiveness, and thus looking at the mix of personalities and values you have within a team can be a really kind of critical piece of information that can be useful to think about how we can improve or increase our team effectiveness. So now that we have established that personality is critical to team success, I just wanted to introduce you to the HOGAN team model. Recently it has been relaunched and enhanced, the HOGAN team model, so I can show you some of the screenshots from the report as well, because this is a really useful tool for using to look at enhancing team effectiveness. I will briefly introduce the HOGAN tools, as some of you may not be current HOGAN trained users, and for those of you that are, this can act as a bit of a refresher for you. And then, as I say, once we've gone through and had a look at the team report model, I wanted just to introduce a case study where I have used it with a recent client. So, the HOGAN team model then. This is based on looking at the impact of personality on teams and identifying particular kind of strengths and potential blind spots. So it really helps us highlight areas where teams may want to consider making behavioural changes to increase their team effectiveness. So ultimately, it's a really great tool to help teams develop. I just wanted to draw your attention there to the fourth point on the slide, which is around the importance of exploring the difference between what we would consider productive conflict and unproductive friction. And what we mean by this is it's not necessarily that every team to be effective, everybody needs to be the same and that we need constant harmony, but in actual fact, research would suggest that a bit of healthy conflict can be a useful tool to have. And one particular psychologist who's been quite influential in this area is a lady by the name of Sherry Campbell, and she's worked quite a lot in this area, and the general theme being that if individuals do feel like they are being consulted as part of a decision-making process, then they will feel more bought in or more part of the team. So it's not necessarily saying that we need to have constant conflict in teams, but just that if people feel they are able to contribute, that they are able to challenge, that they are able to voice their opinion about decision making as part of a team, then they're more likely to feel part of that team. And so from a psychological factors point of view, they'll feel more motivated, more kind of committed to the end objective if they felt part of it. And the last point there around the creating a common language, again, from my personal experience, I found this is really useful. By using the HOGAN framework, it allows the team members to have almost a common language that they can use so that they can help to understand each other better and maybe pick up issues of conflict or differences between people, but gives them a language and a way of addressing those things in a more kind of productive and constructive way. So just briefly then to introduce the three HOGAN tools which sit within the HOGAN team model. You'll see there on the left-hand side we have the HOGAN personality inventory. This is the HPI, and this is an overall measure of temperament. So this is based on the 5-factor model of personality and includes 7 different scales across areas such as how sociable we are, how sensitive we are, how organised an individual is. And within the HOGAN team model, these personality scales have been mapped on some team roles, which I will go on to describe those to you shortly. But the main point being that within a team, in order to have good team effectiveness, we would be looking to have all of those kind of critical roles or those aspects of personality covered within the team. And that if critical roles are not filled, then it could potentially inhibit team performance. Then we have the HOGAN Development Survey. This is the one that's sometimes termed the dark side, you'll see there. This looks at 11 different scales, and the HDS is an instrument that measures overplay strengths. So this is something that looks at areas that most of the time people are likely to use well as strengths, but in certain circumstances, if we overplay it, they can actually have counterproductive aspects. So if we take an example, somebody who's massively kind of creative, imaginative, in overdrive, their ideas can become more and more kind of obscure and off the wall, and they might actually end up confusing others, or they might too quickly leap from one idea, exciting, imaginative idea to the next without thinking of the completion, say, of it. And within the HOGAN team model, what we're mostly looking at is shared derailers, because these are the areas that collectively, if the team all have a shared or similar derailing area, it can end up hindering performance, or it could potentially be a barrier to success. And then we have the MVPI, which is the Motives, Values, Preference Inventory. And this is organised around 10 different areas, 10 different values areas. And this is the piece that really looks at, you'll see there it's termed the insight, because this is looking at something that is much more internally for us as an individual. You know, what is important to me, what really drives me, what motivates me, and therefore what's likely to give you more affinity with your team is if you have some level of shared values with the rest of your team, which ultimately can shape the culture of your team. And again, that's where we would be looking for some kind of alignment across the team values. So looking at these three pieces together really kind of helps us discover whether a team is likely to bond or what fracture lines could appear, and thinking about what qualities they have in terms of what's going to make them more successful, what things could potentially get in the way or they might need to consider as development opportunities. So ultimately, the three tools together then is letting us think about what mix of people do we have, who might work best together, where are there similarities in their values, what might be the challenges. And the HOGAN model allows us to look at all of these things. In addition, I just wanted to make the point that if you are using the HOGAN team report with a team, you are actually supported with a whole load of additional materials that comes alongside just the report. So you would get a user's manual, you get a set of slides that you could use on a team workshop, a facilitator's guide, etc., activities, so that you can frame the team report within a whole kind of workshop with the team. So firstly then, within the Hogan team model, we have the team roles, which I mentioned. This is the one that is made up of the HPI, and this is what links back to those psychological roles I mentioned before, so our informal roles. And they formed or decided what these 5 key roles were from analysing the research. They've looked at things like Belbin's model, MBTI, Bryant, View, just to name that you may be familiar with, and analysed all the past research to come up with these 5 kind of critical psychological roles. Just to let you know what each of those are, and I will, for those of you who are Hogan trained, I'll just let you know how the HPI scales map onto each of these team roles. The results role is about people who have a real kind of drive for action, and that's characterised by people who are high in HPI ambition. Pragmatism is about people who are quite practical minded, and that it includes people who are low both on inquisitive and lower on the interpersonal sensitivity scale in HPI terms. People who fit in the innovation team role tend to be higher around creativity, interested in seeking solutions, and that is encompassed by average scores, at least average scores on inquisitive in the HPI, and being over the 35th percentile or above, at least average in ambition as well. People who fit in the process team role tend to be individuals who bring structure and order, and they are, here we're looking at people's score on the HPI prudence scale, looking for above average scores there. And finally then, the relationships team role is about individuals who are considering collaboration and team cohesiveness, and that there we would be looking at people's HPI sociability and interpersonal sensitivity scales, looking for people to be kind of at the higher end in both of those areas. So with the team roles, you would receive in the report a percentage score of how many of your individuals fit within each of those roles. And ideally, what we would be looking for is a well-represented team would have some team members fitting across all of the different roles, and where there were some roles that weren't filled, then that might suggest a potential performance gap. And I think the fact that we want a kind of spread across the roles is clearly going to be really important from a kind of diversity point of view. And you might think, okay, well, that's quite obvious that yes, we'll just have a spread of roles. But often you find that teams might be self-formed or formed naturally, and in those instances actually we don't necessarily end up with diversity because we are naturally attracted to other people who are like ourselves, and so these self-formed teams don't necessarily have enough kind of diversity of different personalities. So I think that's quite a key point to make really when teams are being formed, that taking into consideration these psychological roles and creating a kind of balance of them is quite important. That way you get a natural kind of push and pull between the different roles, which can create healthy conflict, which I referenced before, and can help teams function more effectively. So just to show you then the output there in terms of what it looks like graphically within the Hogan team report, the team roles would be presented by this graphic here, where for each of the areas in the circle, that's showing you what percentage of your team are fitting within that particular role type. So you'll see in this example here, you have all of your team members are high around the pragmatism, so that practical, hard-headed, pragmatic piece. Half of the group are in the process box, but there's some clear gaps there around certainly innovation and relationships, where there's no members sitting in those boxes, and only 17% of people in the results box. So just kind of I just wanted to visually show you what the output can look like. So the Hogan team model then moves from looking at the team roles first of all, to then looking at the derailers piece. So this is the part of the puzzle where it is all about overplay strengths and things that these are areas that when we overplay it, they can have a downside and very much negatively impact on relationships with others. So it's critical both to think about the success of the team, i.e. are these things derailing and getting in the way of the way the team are interacting together, but also how they're seen outside the organisation. Because a derailer that's exhibited by many team members frequently can ultimately impact negatively on the reputation of the team and how they're seen outside of the organisation. You can also, what we tend to focus on with the HDS or the derailers piece within the Hogan team model is the shared derailers, because what you can find is when you have these counterproductive tendencies that are combined across a fair few people, that it can end up being a bit of a blind spot because it's just their accepted way of dealing with issues, or indeed it can end up actually amplifying the reactions, or it can almost end up being a bit of a kind of arms race by each other responding to outdo each other's derailing behaviour, which can then trigger more derailing behaviours. So yes, it's an interesting thing to look at, but ultimately by bringing these things to the fore, discussing it with individuals, it can help them recognise those shared characteristics so that teams can really kind of work towards trying to mitigate them and come up with solutions perhaps to address some of those behaviours that might not be so positive. So just to give you a little bit of insight into the derailers or the HDS scales. You'll see these are the 11 areas, all of which are positive characteristics. However, in overdrive, they can have a downside. I just wanted to kind of pull out one really to give you a bit of an example. You see there the second one, skeptical. This is one where when it's used as a strength, these people tend to be very kind of astute, very perceptive. They're very good at picking up in inconsistencies in other people's arguments. So it can be a real positive thing. However, thinking about it from a team perspective, if you have a lot of people who are high in this area, it can make people maybe a little bit overly suspicious or think other people might have ill intent, or it can create a bit of a mistrusting environment. I had a team where I was working with, and they, I think around 8 out of the 9 of them were high in this area. And it was really interesting to see as we were presenting the results and talking it through, when we were discussing the skeptical piece, they had a bit of a light bulb moment where they realised that actually this was interfering and getting in the way of them working effectively on a couple of levels. One was they felt like they were being a bit too secretive with the rest of the organisation. They weren't sharing enough with the rest of the organisation because they felt they were being overly suspicious. And internally within themselves, they were all working on their own things very independently in silos, and realised that actually by doing that, by not sharing enough between them, they were really missing out on opportunities to share information, to help, to support each other, to learn from each other. So yes, I just wanted to kind of give you an example of where I found using the model and highlighting an area with the team could really kind of add some value for them. So what does it look like then? So when the HDS results are presented within a Hogan team report, it would graphically look like this, what you have there on the right-hand side. And each of those circles is referencing one of the HDS scales. And what we are interested in, or where the shared derailers are, is where you have more than half of your team are scoring at least an elevated score, and in HDS terms we mean anything over the 70th percentile, but where you have more than half of the team scoring highly in that area, then that is worth investigating or thinking about in terms of being a kind of shared derailer for them. And the way the numbers round the outer edge, that is referring to how many people you have in each of the sectors. So if people's scores are on the left-hand side in the darker 2 sections, then those are people who are scoring highly in that area. So those are the areas that we want to kind of watch out for. Whereas people who are on the right-hand side, they've scored lower in that area, so it's not likely to be so much of a kind of watch out or derailing area for those individuals, really. But I will bring this to life a little bit more for you when we just look at my case study at the end, where I've got one which I can present to you. So the third piece of the Hogan team model then that fits in is to look at the culture, or the MVPI, the motives, values, preference piece of the puzzle. Values do tend to influence the choice and the decisions that team members make, and ultimately it can shape the culture and the sense of shared purpose within the team. So really what you would be looking for is some degree of alignment or shared values amongst the team members, but also, I'd say importantly, some kind of alignment of the team's values with those of the broader organization, because that ultimately will help link to team productiveness and being more effective. And that's a point that we'll come back to actually when I present my case study at the end. And I think the other point to make really is the fact that we're not saying that they have to be sharing every single team value, because clearly that's unrealistic. But at the same time, also we do want diversity, but having some kind of shared value does help to have more cohesion between a team. And just to introduce then, these are the MVPI scales. So it includes things like recognition, so how much praise you like from others as a team thinking about it, affiliation, so how much they interact and share ideas with each other, aesthetics would be how much they're interested in or value having a nice kind of environment around them. And all of these things and having these common values does really assist with the team bonding, making individuals able to enjoy working together. And it also, when we've talked about having that healthy conflict before, if they do have a sense of convergence amongst their values, then that can make it easier for conflict to arise, because it's more likely not to be so kind of personal. It could be more focused on the technical or professional differences if they do have some kind of convergence around their kind of values and what's important to them. Because having these shared values increases people's commitment to the team, the purpose, this increased motivation, and ultimately it can actually reduce, and again there is evidence of this, it can reduce turnover of teams if they feel that they have that kind of common value in place. So again, just from a visual point of view, I just wanted to present to you what the MVPI results would look like in the graphics. So it's just presented there at the bottom of that page. Again, the numbers around the outer edge are showing you how many team members are sitting in each of the quadrants. The slight difference here is with the HDS, we were only looking really at wanting or seeing shared values if you had lots of people at the high end, which is the left-hand side, whereas here it would be either, if it could be a shared value where they all score highly or value it highly, or that they all join in and value it low, in a low degree. So to make that point, you'll see there those two examples. The power is a low percentile, the 21st percentile, and the hedonism is in the 83rd, which would suggest that that's a value area that's high for that team. So within this team, because they overall are valuing power low, that would suggest that they're not a particularly competitive, challenging team. They are perhaps at times a bit more reactive rather than proactive. Potentially they could be lacking drive or push on occasion, and those are the sorts of areas you'd maybe explore with them as a team and thinking about the impact of that. The fact that they're so high on hedonism would suggest that they overall enjoy, are quite fun-loving, want opportunities for time. Ultimately, they will be motivated by enjoyment, by being a bit lively, perhaps even a bit silly at times. But again, thinking about that and how others would view that, could it be that at times they're maybe a little bit too frivolous or undisciplined or easily bored? So again, by knowing what the team values are, we can see, okay, great, these things bring them together. These are the things that really kind of bond them. However, it might also, on occasion, you want to think about what the kind of watch-outs might be, or how the rest of the organization might view them given their values profile. So just before I briefly introduce you to my Case study. This is just to give you a bit of a look at what the sample report looks like. As I say, you would get a full set of materials alongside that, such as slides to use with your team. Each of these pages is just showing you graphically the output for the report, where you've got the graphics I've talked you through, but you'll see you've got quite a bit of interpretive text in there as well. And so that interpretive text just really explains what some of the kind of key themes are that are coming out. And so I find that really useful when I'm preparing for a team workshop, because it foreshadows what those themes might be. So you can both tailor your workshop to fit with the team. So if you know you've got a real kind of fun-loving group, you might want to have more being aware they could be easily distracted, have some fun activities in there, or indeed if they're more kind of structured and ordered, you might want to have a really kind of strict plan for them. But also allow you to think about, consider what the potential development areas might be for the team based on having looked at the results beforehand. And just very briefly there, on the right-hand side, you'll see you've got the individual scores. This is a page that we haven't really discussed, just given the kind of amount of time we've got. But this is a page that you would get for each of the culture, derailers, and roles, where it just shows you which individual is contributing to each of the shared derailing areas, values, and who fits in which of the team roles, and it's all kind of color coordinated. So, to give you an example then, I just wanted to show you, this is a particular team that I worked with fairly recently, and what I think we've not, again, had a huge amount of time to talk about, but is the fact that this is such a useful developmental tool. So quite a nice kind of quote to sum that up, really. I am able to control only that of which I am aware. That of which I am unaware controls me. So a quote from John Whitmore there. I think just really making the point about how important it is to increase an individual's self-awareness. And indeed, within the HOGAN team model, is about increasing our awareness of each other's shared strengths, derailers, personalities. And that awareness is really critical and useful. And that shared language also allows us to call out, say, bad behaviors from others, but gives it a more of a structure and allows us to do that in more of a constructive way. And I do tend to, once I've gone through the team workshop with the team, work with them to come up with an action plan, making it clear what the key outputs are in terms of what differences they might be looking for, and making sure they take responsibility for it. But yes, let me just present to you then this particular case study. So this team, then I'm just going to walk you through the results and show you their development areas that we kind of came up with, was an HR function within a global financial services organization. They were a self-formed team, which you may gather by looking at the team roles here, where they were clearly being attracted to other people like themselves. So you'll see there then we had a massive amount of people sitting in the relationship sector, and then few in any of the other key roles. So whilst they had a very clear sense of mission and purpose in terms of what they were to be achieving, because they were so high around relationships and lower around results and ambition, whilst they were nice and very genuine people who were well liked within the rest of the organization, they by highlighting these results, it was quite clear that when they thought about it, they did need to be focusing more on achieving their goals, taking a more kind of logical and practical approach. And just to make a point there, before we present the team results with them, I had conducted individual feedback sessions with all of them, which I think is a kind of critical, important part of the process, so that people are comfortable with their own results before sharing it in a team. Then with their HDS or their derailers results, again, similar sorts of themes were emerging. So you'll see there the ones highlighted in red were the ones that were considered shared derailers. So they had quite a few came out, because you can see that it was a team of 6. So where you have at least 3 people on the left-hand side, that's showing that of those 3 people, they had at least a score in the 70th. percentile. The reason that some of these overall averages are, say, 65, 68 is because that's a combination of an average of all of the individuals' percentile scores. And obviously the people on the right-hand side will have had lower percentile scores in those areas. But the general themes then were, again, fit with the team role piece really. That colourful scale is all about being kind of outgoing, friendly. The dutiful at the bottom there was all about the fact that they were about relationships, maintaining relationships. They liked people, they wanted to be liked, they got on well with people. The excitable, skeptical, cautious at the top again would suggest they had a real passion for their work, but perhaps overshared their emotions sometimes. The caution and skeptical piece meant perhaps they weren't sharing enough with each other or outside of the organisation, or really saying what they thought. So overall, the kind of themes were across here that they needed to kind of push back and challenge and perhaps be a bit more forceful with their messages. And just one last piece on this is, you may have noticed on the bottom left-hand side, the diligent, they're only 13 percentile, which is a very low average, and all 6 of them in the very low range. So the positive being that that is not going to be a derailer for them, because they are so they aren't going to be overly perfectionistic, certainly. But the watch out that we discussed there was how that tied in with the other 2 instruments, and that that could have been a blind spot for them, because none of them were naturally very attentive to the detail. They needed to consider when they were interacting with the rest of the organisation, were they kind of missing something? Should they be, or should some of them be naturally being more attentive to the detail at times? And then their MVPI results, I've just pulled out the 5 where they had shared values. And again, I mean, out of the 10 scales, they had 5 that were aligned. So that is quite an unusually high number of aligned values areas. So it made for excellent team cohesiveness. They were all on the same page. That high recognition and hedonism at the top meant they were characterized by fun and liked to have a nice time, and that was really evident as how they were as a group or a team. The 3 lower ones at the bottom, security, science in the middle, and tradition on the right-hand side, were all low values areas for them. So that would suggest that they didn't really value or need lots of data. They didn't enjoy the constraints of more traditional ways of working or procedure. They preferred more change, variety. They thrived on ambiguity. And, again, that worked for them. But what was really interesting as part of this discussion was how this fit with the rest of the organisation. And them as a function, okay, great, they were happy with how they were. However, when they really thought about how they interacted with the rest of the organisation, and they thought about their values profile, they realised that actually they're coming from quite a different place, and that the accountants, actuaries, analysts that they're dealing with were likely probably to be at the higher end of that security, science, tradition scales, i.e. dealing and valuing quite different approach. They probably did want more of the kind of the data, were working more within kind of set procedures, and this really highlighted that they needed to think about the impact of their communication style when dealing with the rest of the organisation and getting the most out of that relationship. So, so just to summarise really some of the key development action points then, given the results we went through with them, the sorts of things we came up with was a general point of they needed to talk less about things, take more action, set more specific targets and ensure they were completing them. And whilst they were viewed as being very friendly and helpful people within the business, and they had really good working relationships, they needed to think about the reputation they had in the rest of the organisation. And in actual fact, they had a very valuable service that they were providing, but they needed to consider the messaging and the way they were presenting it, that perhaps they needed to couch it more in data, think more of a commercial focus, push themselves to be a bit more results driven and more attentive to the detail, because that style would work better with their customers or their internal stakeholders, as it were. So yes, just conscious of time, so I won't kind of dwell on that anymore, but obviously happy to kind of address any questions on that if you have any. And just last thing then before I hand you over to Jackie for questions, was just a couple of practicalities really. in terms of if you wanted to use the HOGAN team report, it is, in order to use the team report, you need to be trained in the 3 HOGAN tools. If you are trained in the 3 HOGAN tools, then you just need to attend a free webinar, which can be viewed. It's just short, about half an hour, to familiarise you in a bit more detail about the aspects of the report. And as I say, you'd also get a set of workshop materials. The cost of the report is £1,025 plus VAT for the team report. You would obviously have the individual reports for them already as well. But in ways of thanks for you taking the time to listen to our webinar today, we just wanted to offer you a 20% discount for anybody if they did want to purchase any team reports before the end of May of this year, which takes the report price down to £820. But of course, if you have any kind of further questions or anything like that afterwards, then I've popped my email address on there, so please do feel free to email me. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah. So we've had some questions in here. So first of all, which questions do participants complete to generate the team report? Which assessments?
So, good question. So each individual, in order to produce the team report, would complete the normal self-report HPI, MVPI, and HDS. So it's just the standard individual HOGAN instruments that they complete. So you would generate individual reports for each of the people for their own results and do an individual feedback session on that beforehand, and then the output in the team report is all just an aggregate collection of those individual scores from the 3 normal HOGAN questionnaires.
Okay, great. So how much of this is personality based rather than emotional intelligence?
Well, I mean, I would say there is a crossover between personality and emotional intelligence, and we do use an emotional intelligence instrument separately to this, actually, and when we run correlations, there are similarities, but I guess it's coming from a slightly different perspective, whereas emotional intelligence we tend to talk about is very much something that you can work on and develop as a skill. Personality, from a kind of trait HOGAN point of view, would tend to be much more of a kind of stable entity, so not something that you can change massively, but that if you're conscious of trying to develop certain areas, then certainly we can kind of make alterations to those. So I would say that this is more about not necessarily changing people's personalities, but understanding more about the differences between team members' personalities.
Okay. Do you recommend doing individual feedbacks before a team report day?
Yes, I would say that that's really critical. We do have clients sometimes who say, oh yes, we just want a kind of quick team session, but I think from my experience, people get a lot more from it. They're a lot more bought into it. They understand it a lot more if they have had individual feedback sessions beforehand, so that they're much more comfortable. They understand it much better when they're in that kind of team setting.
Okay. And so what do you do if team members are sensitive about their profiles being shared?
I mean, I would say that in my experience, teams tend to be happy to share the results, but the way the report is structured, those kind of key graphics I've been presenting in the webinar, you could just show those and they actually have no names on it, so you could do it so it is anonymous and people don't need to share their individual results. And obviously if there's anybody in the team who weren't comfortable to show their results, you could do it in that way, so you don't necessarily have to have kind of people's names on it. However, I would say that during the individual feedback sessions beforehand, when you're kind of explaining it and exploring it all, if it's pitched in the right sort of way, people should kind of understand and see that there is a benefit to them being happy to kind of share the results when they're in the session. And indeed, when I've done it where it has been anonymized for whatever reason, when we've done the team event, people tend to pitch in and just say, oh, well, I'm happy to share my results, and then they actually, share the results with the rest of the people, and other team members find that really useful because they think they are learning more about their colleagues and so they can understand them better.
Okay. And how long would you recommend spending on team workshop?
I would say as a minimum, we do it over about a day. Again, sometimes clients try and kind of squeeze us down depending on how much time people have. I think if you are given less than a day, so say just half a day, then I would say you probably just want to pull out and focus on a couple of the instruments rather than trying to get through all the data in a half day, because it's an awful lot of information to explore in a short period of time, and you'll get much more from it if you have at least a day, if not a day and a half. So say a day to present all of these findings, and then perhaps the second half day to start action planning and coming up with development ideas. Or another thing I've done is to present all of the results over a kind of day session and then revisit it like a week later or whenever works to come up with some more kind of specific action so that something is done with the results rather than just saying, oh, well, that's nice and leaving it in the bottom of the drawer.
Great. Okay, thanks very much, Sarah. That's all the questions. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we will be sharing a recording of the webinar. So if you want to share that with any of your colleagues, as well as a copy of the slides. So we'll be emailing that in the next day or so. But thanks very much for your time today. And thanks, Sarah. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.